You know who Al Capone was. You watched Scarface. You watched The Untouchables. You saw the sharp-attired man with the cigar, the scar, and the overcoat. You know Elliot Ness took him down. You know he was the criminal mastermind. You know how he died. The complication. Almost everything you know was fabricated. And the 23 facts I am about to reveal are going to demolish every stratum of that mythology. Fact 1. Nobody dared call Al Capone Scarface to his face. Here is something people do not recognize. The celebrated designation Scarface was manufactured by Chicago newspapers, not the underworld. Upon the streets and behind the scenes of the mob, anyone who articulated that term near Capone would likely depart in a casket. Al Capone himself detested the label. He preferred informing journalists that the markings upon his countenance were war wounds earned fighting for his nation in the First World War. A fabrication. Capone never donned a uniform. The truth is simpler and more humiliating. In 1917, at 18 years of age, he was laboring at a bar in Brooklyn and articulated a crude observation regarding Frank Galluccio's sister. Frank extracted a pocket knife and slashed his face 3 times. Capone transported that mortification beneath his epidermis until the terminal day of his existence. Fact 2. He was born in Brooklyn, not Italy. Here is something that will startle you. Al Capone, the man who transformed into the emblem of the Italian mafia in America, never set foot in Italy. He was born on January 17, 1899, within a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, affirmatively, were immigrants from the Naples region. But Alphonse was American upon paper, raised upon the streets of New York like any other adolescent in the neighborhood. He articulated fluent English with that dense Brooklyn accent, and scarcely recognized the Italian he heard at home. So why did everyone perceive him as a foreigner? Because prosecutors and newspapers of that interval painted that image deliberately. It was simpler to convict a dangerous Italian than to concede that the nation's most substantial criminal had been born and raised directly there within the United States. Fact 3. He never finished elementary school. Here is something that will startle you. The man who displaced millions never completed elementary education. Al Capone abandoned public school PS 133 in Brooklyn at 14. After striking a teacher across the face. He was expelled that identical day and never set foot within a classroom again. But devote attention to what arrives next. When the FBI finally obtained his accounting ledgers, government experts were stunned. They articulated that Capone's financial organization was comparable to a Fortune 500 company, all absorbed upon the streets through trial and error, managing rivers of illicit currency from alcohol, casinos, and protection. An adolescent with no diploma operating an empire that would humiliate numerous Wall Street executives. If that fact astonished you, merely envision the subsequent one. Deposit a like, subscribe, and comment. Would you possess the fortitude to labor for Capone? Fact 4. Capone was running 161 businesses. Simultaneously, here is something that will drop your mandible to the floor. In 1927, at the zenith of his empire, Al Capone operated 161 speakeasies across Chicago, plus 35 gambling establishments, 14 casinos, and a collection of brothels that no one was ever capable of enumerating properly. Upon the payroll, 1,000 men labored for him, not referencing the hundreds more who depended upon the operation peripherally. The IRS calculated that the currency entering reached $60 million annually, approaching $1 billion in contemporary valuation. And now arrives the component that aggravates any honest American who discharges their taxes punctually. Capone did not report a solitary cent of it to the government, not one nickel. That arrogance was precisely what planted the seed of his destruction. Fact 5. The man who actually put Capone behind bars was not Elliot Ness. Everyone recognizes the narrative of Elliot Ness and his untouchables taking down Al Capone. It became a motion picture, a television series, an American legend. But the individual who actually positioned Capone behind bars was a figure almost no one recognizes. Frank Wilson, an IRS agent who expended his days sifting through receipts and accounting ledgers. Capone was convicted in October 1931 for tax evasion, not bootlegging or murder. Ness and his team never managed to substantiate a solitary crime directly connected to Capone. In fact, Ness was excluded from the IRS investigation because they considered his group excessively conspicuous for labor that demanded silence and patience. The most revelatory component is that when Ness composed his book in 1957, articulating his version of events, the IRS itself refused to review the manuscript. The rationale, they regarded it as fiction. Fact 6. He opened one of the first soup kitchens in the United States. When the Great Depression devastated the American economy in 1930, millions of families possessed nothing to consume. And who materialized to assist? One of the most wanted criminals in the nation. Al Capone inaugurated a soup kitchen upon Chicago's South Side that served up to 3,500 meals daily, all financed from his own pocket. It is estimated that he expended between $70 and $100 daily, a fortune during that epoch. Most Chicago newspapers treated it as nothing beyond a publicity maneuver. But what few individuals recognized was that Capone had matured experiencing hunger in Brooklyn. He recognized that reality intimately. Historians who examined the case subsequently confirmed there existed something authentic there. Chicago's most feared gangster was executing what the government itself could not. Fact 7. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. He lived in terror of being poisoned after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Something altered within Al Capone. The man who governed Chicago commenced existing with one perpetual terror, being poisoned. He engaged someone exclusively to sample every meal before he consumed it. He only imbibed from vessels that were unsealed directly before him. When he traveled, he imported his own culinary preparer, because he trusted no one any longer. No plate reached his table without being inspected. And here arrives the component few individuals recognize. When he was arrested in 1931, one of the inaugural matters Capone negotiated with the authorities was authorization to receive nourishment prepared by his own wife, May. America's most feared gangster was not terrified of shootouts or law enforcement. But he could not seat himself for dinner without contemplating what was positioned upon his plate. Fact 8. The massacre that turned the public against him. Before February 14, 1929, much of Chicago tolerated Capone. He distributed soup to the unemployed and preserved the municipality operating behind the scenes. But that day, 7 men connected to Bugs Moran were executed within a garage. The detail few individuals recognize is that internal documentation suggests Capone did not directly authorize the attack. His subordinates acted autonomously, and that altered everything. Public sentiment turned against him instantaneously. President Herbert Hoover personally contacted J. Edgar Hoover and issued a direct directive: take Capone down. The man who operated within the shadows now had the federal government's illumination directed at him. One solitary day of violence demolished years of meticulous strategy and converted a businessman of crime into a national target. Fact 9. He was arrested 6 times and walked free every time. Contemplate this. Between 1920 and 1930, Al Capone was arrested 6 occasions. 6. And none of those arrests resulted in anything substantial. It was not because there was insufficient evidence. It was because Capone possessed judges, prosecutors, and police chiefs within his grasp. In 1927, government estimates indicated he expended approximately $75 million exclusively upon bribes. To extend you perspective, that exceeded the entire annual revenue of the Chicago Police Department. The complete municipality, in a manner, operated beneath his control. Police captains accepted directives from him, not from the mayor. Capone did not require fleeing from the law. He merely unsealed his wallet, and the law oriented itself elsewhere. It required the federal government becoming involved for someone to finally affix something upon him. And even then, it was not for murder or bootlegging. It was for income tax. Fact 10. He attended Mass every Sunday. With a pistol beneath his suit, the man who authorized killings without blinking attended Mass every Sunday. Al Capone regarded himself as a practicing Catholic and made a point of attending church, frequently with a firearm concealed beneath his garments. He possessed images of saints throughout his residence and office, but it extended beyond faith. Capone consulted a numerologist before executing business determinations as though they were a strategic advisor. The numeral 13 constituted his personal nightmare. He refused to attend any assembly with precisely 13 individuals within the chamber. On one occasion, he received intelligence that he would be assassinated upon a Thursday. The result: he remained secured within his chamber the entire day and did not emerge for anything. The attack never transpired, and to him, that exclusively substantiated the superstition functioned. The man who governed Chicago with an iron fist existed in terror of forces he could not perceive or govern. Fact 11. The disease that started destroying him before prison. Al Capone contracted syphilis within the very brothels he controlled, likely somewhere between 1920 and 1925. Treatment existed during that epoch. arsenic-based, but he refused to receive treatment. Partly from pride, partly from mortification. And that determination cost him profoundly. The pathology persisted in advancing silently until it reached his nervous apparatus, what physicians designate neurosyphilis. Across time, Capone commenced forfeiting the capacity to contemplate with clarity, to strategize, to execute rapid determinations. By approximately 1930, his own men could already discern something was amiss. They commenced acting autonomously without soliciting authorization. The boss who governed Chicago was becoming incapable of governing himself. It is ironic when you pause and contemplate it. It was not law enforcement. It was not his adversaries. And it was not even incarceration that commenced destroying Capone. It was a pathology he could have addressed and elected to disregard. Fact 12. The tax evasion conviction required 5 years to construct. Here is something few individuals recognize. The man who dismantled Al Capone did not employ a firearm. He employed a pen. Frank Wilson, an IRS agent, commenced excavating through Capone's finances in 1926, half a decade prior to the trial. Wilson and his team expended interminable nights sifting through more than 2 million documents, all manually, with no computational apparatus. Within the center of all that documentation, they discovered 12 transactions exhibiting currency entering the boss's accounts with no explication whatsoever. Wilson also managed to convert 3 of Capone's former associates who consented to testify. In October 1931, the verdict descended. 11 years behind bars and an $80,000 penalty, the largest ever imposed for a tax crime within the nation up to that juncture. Fact 13. In prison, he directed an orchestra. When Capone arrived at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 1932, he did not simply occupy space. Before long, he assembled a band composed of fellow inmates designated the Rock Islanders. Capone performed upon the banjo and regarded rehearsals with gravity, 3 occasions weekly. Upon weekends, the ensemble performed for the remainder of the prison population. The prison warden himself, A.C. Adderhold, even characterized Capone as a model inmate throughout his initial 2 years. But that phase terminated expeditiously. In 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, the most feared penitentiary in the nation. There, everything transformed. His currency and notoriety signified nothing within those barriers. Even worse, other inmates perceived him as an opportunity to construct their own reputation. Capone, who had once governed all of Chicago, now was compelled to monitor his own back merely to survive an additional day. Fact 14. Alcatraz and the collapse of his mind. When he arrived at Alcatraz in 1934, Capone discovered that currency could acquire nothing upon that island, 0 privileges, 0 specialized treatment. The guards regarded him like any other inmate. In 1936, another prisoner stabbed him. But what genuinely demolished Capone was not the physical violence. The syphilis he had been transporting for years commenced gradually consuming his brain. Guards commenced documenting disturbing scenes. Capone would converse with himself within his cell, disputing with individuals who were not present. He believed he was still in Chicago, operating his criminal empire. In 1938, at merely 39 years of age, he was transferred to a prison hospital. The diagnosis bequeathed no ambiguity: advanced dementia. The man who once governed an entire municipality could no longer govern his own cognition. Fact 15. His release was a whisper, not a headline. In November 1939, while the world was preparing for conflict in Europe, Al Capone walked out of incarceration with no ceremonial accompaniment. The man who had once governed all of Chicago was released prematurely because his health had been demolished. The syphilis he never adequately addressed had advanced so extensively that his brain no longer functioned in the manner it previously had. He proceeded directly to a mansion upon Palm Island, Florida, where he expended the concluding 8 years of his existence practically concealed from the world. The newspapers that once dedicated enormous headlines to his every movement scarcely printed a modest note regarding his release. But the most disturbing detail is what his own family subsequently reported. At intervals, Capone did not recognize the individuals encircling him, and conducted himself like a 12-year-old child. America's most feared gangster concluded his days angling within a swimming pool, entirely lost within his own cognition. Fact 16. He perished practically without a cent. His designation on January 25, 1947. Al Capone drew his concluding breath at 48, from cardiac arrest exacerbated by pneumonia. And here is what almost no one communicated to you. The man who once displaced millions weekly in Chicago perished with less than $100 in currency to his own designation. Everything that persisted was entangled within real estate in Florida. The criminal fortune, it had been distributed among relatives and frontmen to evade federal confiscation. Meanwhile, his former associates rode the wave of Prohibition's repeal in 1933, transformed into legitimate alcohol distributors and accumulated wealth without requiring concealment. Capone, incarcerated at the incorrect moment, missed the celebration and missed his position within history. Fact 17. Capone's most celebrated quotation. He never articulated it. I wager you have encountered that line previously. You can get further with kind words and a gun than with kind words alone. Everyone swears it emerged from Al Capone's mouth. Well, fortify yourself. He never articulated it, not once. I examined trial transcriptions, newspaper interviews from that period, personal correspondence. Nothing. Zero. The quotations exclusively materialized in 1967, 2 decades after Capone was already interred, and conjecture where, within a theatrical production. A screenwriter required a forceful line for the character, manufactured it, and the world purchased the narrative. Amusing to contemplate, is it not? Chicago's most feared gangster became recognized for terms that emerged from some arbitrary writer's cognition. The legend frequently weighs more than the authentic man. Fact 18. The Saint. Valentine's Day Massacre. The rival who never arrived. Here is a twist. Few individuals recognize that the celebrated Saint Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929 was orchestrated by Al Capone with one unambiguous objective: to eliminate Bugs Moran, his most substantial rival in Chicago. Upon that freezing morning, 7 men from Moran's organization were aligned against the wall of a garage and executed without clemency. But here is the detail. Moran never entered that structure. He materialized late, observed what appeared to be a law enforcement raid at the entrance. It was the gunmen attired as officers, and reversed direction upon the sidewalk. Subsequently, he informed a journalist, only Al Capone kills like that. The strangest component. Capone was in Miami with an alibi upon paper, while his men were executing the brutal labor more than 1,000 miles distant. Fact 19. The government knew everything and executed nothing for a decade. This is the classification of phenomenon that registers as counterfeit, but is not. Since 1921, the federal government had possessed detailed documentation upon Al Capone. Bootlegging, extortion, connections to murders, bribing politicians. It was all documented. And what did they execute with that intelligence? Absolutely nothing. For 10 years, it resided there, accumulating particulate matter within office drawers. The complication was technical. Almost everything Capone executed constituted a state crime, not a federal one, and at the state stratum he possessed judges, law enforcement officers, and prosecutors within his grasp. The federal government simply did not possess unambiguous jurisdiction to act. It required IRS agents arriving upon a concept no one had attempted previously, arguing that currency from illicit activity remained taxable income. It registers as self-evident today, but during that epoch it was an entirely unprecedented maneuver. America's most substantial criminal did not collapse because of violence or bootlegging. He collapsed because he did not discharge his taxes. Fact 20. The Atlantic City meeting that redrew American crime in May 1929, something transpired in Atlantic City that altered American crime permanently. Al Capone assembled bosses from 7 distinct municipalities at a seaside hotel. No one had ever executed that previously. The concept was elementary. Cease terminating one another and partition the territory like businessmen. For 3 days, these individuals negotiated operational zones, concurred upon pricing, and generated regulations for resolving conflicts absent bloodshed. Capone, at merely 30 years of age, commanded the proceedings. What emerged from that assembly established the foundation for what the FBI would, decades subsequently, designate La Cosa Nostra, the American Mafia organized upon a national magnitude. But here arrives the component no one anticipated. 2 days following the assembly, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia. The rationale: illicit possession of a firearm. The man who had just reconfigured the cartography of crime in the United States was taken down for transporting a revolver in his pocket. Fact 21. May Coughlin. The woman who stayed May Coughlin married Capone in 1918. She was 21. He was merely 19. They had a son, Sonny, who was born partially deaf because of congenital syphilis transmitted by his own father. Now contemplate that. While Capone existed encircled by violence, currency, and newspaper headlines, May remained behind the scenes within silence. When he was arrested, she visited him with regularity. When he emerged from incarceration with his cognition demolished by syphilis, May was the one who cared for him for 8 consecutive years, day after day, until his death in 1947. What is striking is this: she never extended a solitary interview, never composed a volume, never merchandised a narrative to a newspaper or periodical. She lived until 1986, reaching 89 years of age, and still refused to articulate publicly regarding her husband until her terminal day. During an interval when everyone encircling Capone was pursuing celebrity or effortless currency, May selected absolute silence. Fact 22. The newspapers buried him when Al Capone perished in January 1947. The New York Times entombed the intelligence upon page 14. Within that identical edition, the death of Grace Moore, an opera vocalist few individuals recall today, received front-page coverage. The Chicago Tribune, the newspaper of the municipality Capone practically governed during the 1920s, devoted merely 3 paragraphs to the narrative. Contemplate that for a moment. The individual who displaced millions throughout Prohibition, who commanded an army of gunmen and purchased politicians like individuals purchase cigarettes, transformed into a footnote within his own municipality's newspaper. America had advanced. The Second World War altered everything. No one cared any longer regarding a syphilitic gangster who could scarcely assemble sentences. Authentic interest in that epoch exclusively returned decades subsequently when historians commenced excavating through the archives. The man who dominated Chicago for a decade perished forgotten, demented, and irrelevant. Fact 23. Hollywood invented a Capone to conceal the Capone America created within the motion pictures. He materializes as a criminal genius, a singular figure who constructed an empire independently. Scarface, The Untouchables, Boardwalk Empire. They all recount the identical narrative, an extraordinary man who challenged America, but the reality was profoundly distinct. Capone was not an exception, he was a consequence. Prohibition rendered illicit something that millions of Americans still desired to continue executing. Politicians voted for the prohibition and persisted in consuming behind the scenes. Law enforcement officers accepted bribes because their compensation could not compete with bootlegging currency. And impoverished Italian immigrants, possessing no access to respectable occupations, discovered within organized crime the identical trajectory that affluent families pursued behind the scenes of politics. A Capone who constitutes a genius transforms into entertainment. A Capone who constitutes inevitable transforms into a mirror. Hollywood perpetually selected entertainment because the mirror is substantially too uncomfortable.